Welcome to STEAM Powered, where I have conversations with women in STEAM to learn a little bit about what they do and who they are. I'm your host, Michelle Ong. I'm introducing additional content formats to STEAM Powered, and one will take the form of segues, where I have the opportunity to share more fascinating stories relating to women in STEAM, as well as other plot bunnies that take my fancy. To that end, my guest today is RJ Andrews. RJ is a data storyteller who helps organizations solve information problems. He is the editor of the book series Information Graphic Visionaries, celebrating spectacular data visualization creators. Join us as we talk about Florence Nightingale, nurse, statistician, social reformer, and data visionary. We speak about her intriguing story and how she used data visualization in her campaign for sanitary reform. Welcome, RJ. Thank you so much for joining me today on STEAM Powered. I'm really looking forward to speaking with you today about Florence Nightingale, the subject of one of the books in your series, Information Graphics Visionaries.
Thank you so much for having me. Yeah, she's a real pistol, so I'm excited to talk all about her.
Amazing. Okay, so we'll get to that in a little bit, but I'm very much interested in others' journeys, and I'd love to learn a little bit about yours because, before becoming a data storyteller, you started off in mechanical engineering. So, how did you get from mech eng through to data storytelling and visualization?
Working as a pure engineer for several years, I realized that the world's biggest problems were really not technology problems; they were people problems. And so I sought a craft and a career path that allowed me to apply some of my technical talents, but also work a little bit more closely with people and people problems. And that combined with some sparks of inspiration at MIT's Media Lab, where I got really turned on to the world of bits, it inspired me to go and chase this craft that is sometimes called data storytelling. Sometimes we call it data visualization. Think
Mm,
charts, maps, diagrams, um, information graphics. That's sort of like the home base for me. But really, it's not about creating information. It's about informing people, and so really, you're in a communications art, even though it takes a lot of technical skill still in order to practice that art.
absolutely. And, with all the data that we do have kind of floating all around us today, it's so important to be able to communicate that to people, especially when, a lot of it is very technical, very detailed, and hard to communicate normally under those circumstances. So how do you get to that level of, cultivate that creativity to be able to communicate some of these very complex concepts to, I guess, as we'll be talking about, the sparrows, the general population and people who wouldn't normally be, so technically inclined?
There's depending on what you're trying to convey, there's a lot of different ways to do it. Um, One approach that I love is embodied cognition, and so embodied cognition is that we are all people and we all have fairly similar bodies, sort of forward-facing eyes and eyes that are near the tops of our heads, things like this. And because we have bodies and we live in a physical world, we interact with a physical world, we can lean into our embodied cognition to represent things that are actually invisible, things that we can't see. We can make them visible using tools like data visualization. So, for example, when you're in a forest, the trees are very large, but then you might see a red cardinal fly through the forest, and even though it's very small, its motion and its salient color is going to catch your attention. And so that is something where you're taking the evolutionary, sort of biology of the eye and how our brain processes information. You're saying, oh, well, if something's red, maybe even if it's moving, if you're on a computer screen, then then you can catch somebody's attention. And it's very basic things like that to things like, well, we want to visualize the economic gross domestic product of a country, and we're going to use a bar chart, and we're going to compare two countries, one country versus the other. And the bar chart is based on a metaphor, which is basically a stack of stuff. And we can stack things in real life, like we can stack a stack of coins. Not too many coins, or the stack will probably fall over. We certainly can't stack all the coins or all the bills necessary to actually represent an economy, but we can use that metaphor to represent it in a way that many people can access, or at least it can make it easier to access. And another important thing when you're trying to convey information is understand that one of the reasons people can access that metaphor is because it's a commonly used metaphor. It's part of our common culture, our communication culture, and this is a very recently developed and recently established communication culture, the culture of data visualization. But there are already norms, and there are already ways of conveying information that we can reuse, and that can lower the barriers to access for much of our audience.
Yeah, absolutely. It's because of the way that, a lot of people will say that, they're visual learners, or they're written learners, but
Mhm.
because a lot of the way that we interact with the world is visual, being able to relate all of these concepts in a visual manner in ways that, we can kind of compare to what we normally do in our day to day just makes things so much easier to process. It's fantastic.
Yes, well, it's a high throughput channel. The eyes, you can take in a lot
Yes.
of information with your eyes.
Yes, absolutely. So, Florence Nightingale, nicknamed the Lady with the Lamp from when she did her patient rounds at night during the Crimean War. Her name is synonymous with the ideal of someone who's compassionate or caring of the ill or disadvantaged, and the namesake of the grossly inaccurate Nightingale effect, which describes a situation where the carer develops romantic feelings towards a patient. But there will be those who may not be aware that Florence Nightingale was not just a nurse, she was a statistician, social
Mm.
reformer, and founder of modern nursing, and is one of the subjects of your book series, Information Graphic Visionaries. But let's backtrack a little. What motivated you to write the series in the first place?
Oh, so it's multi-pronged. It was partially my experience publishing my first book, Info We Trust: How to Inspire the World with Data, and sort of the lessons and sort of the thorns and thistles I experienced publishing that and wanting to do it better the next time around.
Hmm.
It was partially recognizing that there was a certain maturity that was happening in publications about data visualization, and in particular the history of data visualization. And the existing publications created an opportunity because what they did is they established a catalog.
Mm.
And but what they didn't do, or what most did not do, and has not been done, is to go really deep and to focus a lens on exactly how did this happen, what happened, why did it happen. And to me, as an enthusiast for the craft of information graphics, I believe it's very, very important to elevate the craft of information graphics. And in order to do that, we have to start treating it in the same way that we might treat fine art. So the Mona Lisa painting, or treat a pure science like E equals MC squared, right? And so these are icons, and not only
Yeah.
they're icons, but they're icons that have entire exhibitions organized around them, or they're icons that have movies and TV shows and books written about them, and just sort of an obsessive cultural lens focused on them. I'm like, well, we have to treat information graphics with the same respect, and they deserve the same care and honor, but also scrutiny. And so
Mm.
that's one of the motivations for the series. But don't discount the first thing I said, which I do. I'm a bibliophile, and I love beautiful books. I love making beautiful books, and so this is also an opportunity to make beautiful artifacts.
Yes. And again, storytelling and, of all that amazing history that, you know, shapes what we do today with all of this kind of thing. And, I really did love reading your book. It was fascinating. It had so many additional rabbit holes through the 1800s
Yes,
where so much stuff actually did happen in
yes.
progressing where we are technologically and, socially. It's amazing. So, how did data visualization factor into Florence Nightingale's work?
So Nightingale enters the Crimean War, which with a lot of mathematical firepower, um, and with having studied statistics, but she wasn't a data visualization expert entering the war. And in fact, she didn't do an enormous amount of data work while at war. She used tables of information to run her operations, and she did some maybe comparative analysis in the sense that she understood how many people were dying in this army versus that army. But her statistical triumphs really come after the war. And they're due in large part because she meets this guy at a dinner party, and his name's William Farr, and Dr. Farr is the top statistical talent in all of England. And he had done a lot of data visualization. Not only had he done a lot of data visualization, but he had an entire team of clerks working for him at the General Register office. And at this General Register office, or GRO, Farr had published several publications over the previous decades with data visualization. So she and Farr hit it off, and they start educating one another over about the first 6 months of their relationship, of their working relationship. And so she's telling him about the war. She's telling him about where they can get data about the war, and at the same time, he's lecturing her and sharing papers with her, getting her up to speed on statistics. And statistics at this time isn't quite how we imagine statistics, and maybe that would be an interesting aside. Um, at the end of their and so through this process, she's exposed to Farr's data visualization, and Nightingale purposes the data visualization, the crafted data visualization, in a very particular way. So she doesn't use data visualization to do analysis. What she does is she uses data visualization to attract attention to her work, and also to convey very, very basic numerical facts to her audience. And so
Hmm.
you mentioned earlier the sparrows. She wanted to use data visualization to catch the sparrows, meaning to catch common people. And she doesn't mean common people like lower middle class commoners. What she's talking about is people who have common intellectual ability. So she's talking in particular about royals. She's talking about military officers. And in some sense, she's also talking about medical officers, doctors, who don't really understand statistics. And the type of statistics they're doing is somewhat particular, doing population statistics, basically what we call today social science.
Yes. And so at that time, because it seemed very new from how it was described in the book, that people didn't really take these sorts of numbers into account. You had totals and sums, but they didn't really break it down any further to be able to determine causality or for efficiency or for administration purposes. It seemed as though the way that Nightingale handled these statistics in the way of handling systems thinking and systems engineering was very new to that period. Is that really the case from back then?
Yeah, so if we zoom out a little bit from Nightingale herself and what she did
Mm,
with Farr, is that the typical statistical tools we have now are sort of mathematical, analytical, non-visual tools, like correlation and regression. So regression analysis, here's a number that represents how related these two phenomena are. So they didn't. This was not fully developed yet, and certainly not widely adopted yet. And so, what did they have to rely on to understand, are these two phenomena related? They had visual analytics, and so what they would do is they make pictures, and they would use these pictures to compare phenomena. And these pictures are bar charts. They're two maps, choropleth maps, colored in the same way, and then put side by side and see, is there any pattern? Is there any relationship? And so, data visualization is broadly being used to power a lot of simple analysis, what we consider simple analysis. Um, at the same time, again, zoomed out a little bit, we have an explosion of data, and particularly an explosion of data in Great Britain. The reason there's an explosion of data is because there's a bunch of social reform laws passed in the 1830s. One of them is the mass collection and mass production of data, of civil data, particularly who's born, who dies, and who's getting married. And on those data forms, you have interesting things like cause of death, and then from those forms, you have an entire bureaucracy generated of standardizing how this data is recorded, generated. How do you determine cause of death? Are all the causes of death the same? So if Nightingale enters the story at a time where there's sort of a nice platform of established visualization and established civilian data, but the military is a relative mess to civilian operations.
Mm.
And so the British Army, their data quality is very poor. Everything is sort of written by hand in a variety of formats. There's no one person or one unit looking at over all the data and analyzing it in any sort of holistic fashion. And that doesn't mean that lonely people are not trying to do it on their own, but there's no top-down vision for how Army data could be put to work to save lives. And so a lot of the story of Nightingale is recognizing the strength of civilian data, which she witnessed by her association with Farr, and trying to bring the British Army data up to the same height.
Absolutely. And because they hadn't gotten to that stage where they were thinking about data and statistics and organization in that way, it was very difficult for her to convey the importance of having this information in a structured format, to get them on board, to get them to, start developing the systems to make things more efficient in more than just the pure military way, like the entire stuff with hospitals and with caring for their actual soldiers and their people and their resources. So, what were the sorts of issues that Nightingale faced when she was trying to get the army up to speed with all of this kind of new design for data?
So the army, just like any organization, is very resistive to relinquishing any control. And so there's a number of reforms that they were seeking, and sort of two big buckets. One is supply chain, so supplies, so clothing and food, and what are people eating, and where they, sort of what sort of tents are they sleeping in, and how are these being provisioned, how are they being properly supplied to the soldiers. So that's sort of one big bucket, and the other big bucket they called sanitary reform. And you could think of sanitary reform as we associate sanitation now with cleanliness, and so that's a product of this era. But if you think of the word sanitary, it really comes from I think sanitas, which is health, right, in Latin. And so there's like a switch that happens in this period where this idea of good health is being associated slowly with cleanliness. And again, we're still a couple decades before the germ theory of diseases is shown to be true. And so people are having an inkling of how things work, the mechanisms, but there's still quite a lot of argument about how communicable diseases are spread. And so coming out of the war, Nightingale is applying a lot of effort across lots of different types of reform. But after working with Farr for several months, they hone in on this idea of sanitary reform, and in particular focusing on hygiene, not the hygiene of the individual patient, but the hygiene of the built environment, the hygiene of where the soldiers are staying, in particular the hygiene of the hospitals. And so when we talk about hygiene, we talk about mainly clean sewer lines. And so the ability to wash and flush all the filth away from wherever you're staying. And then in addition to that, we're talking about having having circulating air. So having the quantity of an air in the room, change because, windows are open on either side and you're sucking air through the room. And these are timeless things that are still very relevant. With COVID-19 pandemic, we've had quite a lot of discussion about how do you increase airflow and replace the air in a room, a lot faster, whether you're in an airplane tube or a classroom or a hospital. And so this is sort of what they focused on, and this is what they decided to build their data visualization around. And so the data visualization, has nothing to do with supplies. And it actually focuses very narrowly on sanitary reform. And the her data visualization is it evolved, meaning that she she built she iterated the development of her graphics and their accompanying tables of numerals, statistical tables, and text, um, starting with sort of one approach and then refining it over a several year time span. And so what it eventually evolved to is this, very eloquent, very scathing sort of production where she says, step one, look at how many people are dying. Step two, here are the causes of their death. And so the first step is you're supposed to be outraged at how many people are dying. The second step, here are the causes of the deaths. And what you realize is that all these soldiers are dying, and most of them are not dying from battle wounds. Most of them are
Mm.
dying from preventable diseases. And step three is, and we know how to prevent these diseases. The solution is sanitary reform. And she shows an image where here's how many people are dying before sanitary reforms are introduced. And then look, sanitary reforms are introduced at this point, and then afterwards, there are far fewer deaths. And so it's a 1, 2, 3, shock and awe with how many people die. Here's why they're dying, and that's even more shocking because these are preventable deaths. And don't believe me? Look, we implemented reforms and people stopped dying. And this 1, 2, 3 step is very, very eloquent. The data that she's presenting is framed in a very particular way uh, to promote this idea. And it's interesting because the idea is right. Like, the idea is true. Um, as you read in the essay, Stephen Johnson wrote about the three innovations that saved over 1 billion lives across the last century or so, and sanitary reform is one of the three. And so they're right to kind of to promote this, and they sort of knew that they were right, but the way that they promoted it was they almost propagandized it with
Yeah.
the um, salacious graphics, the salacious language, the intense focus on just a single solution, not sort of like, here are 12 things you can do. It's like, no, this is the
Mm.
one thing that you're not doing, and that's why everybody's dying. And so it was an incredible lesson in Nightingale's gives us an incredible lesson in what it takes to actually achieve reform.
Mm.
It's not just a lesson in sort of analysis or, boots on the ground, like doing something heroic, but actually the persistence and the focus and the resources necessary to achieve reform.
Yes. And the interesting thing about Nightingale is that she didn't want to do this in a way where, she would receive the hero's welcome. A lot of the work that she did was kind of not really covert, but it was picking the right people, showing the right, you know, people in government, in policy, in all these different areas,
Yes.
the right information, and getting them really kind of, engaged and emotional about the information that she was presenting. And she did this, with the rose diagrams as well, which was, what you were describing as, it was so beautifully eloquent to be able to demonstrate that 1, 2, 3 punch that you described.
Yeah, so her celebrity is really interesting, and her and so there's two sides to this. One is that she becomes a celebrity while at war, very quickly. In fact, I mean, I think like 3 or 4 months into her service after she lands, the London paper's already writing about her, and there's a lot of reasons, for why she becomes a celebrity. But basically, these reasons are sort of detached from reality.
Mm,
Like, she really was sort of this angelic light of Christ, heroine that the soldiers, their own personal Valkyrie that the soldiers look to. But her day-to-day operations and what she was actually doing had little relationship to the celebrity persona that the London papers formed around her. And so the London
yeah.
papers create a caricature or a character that takes off, and
Mm.
way more famous than anybody today. I mean, her fame rivaled the Queen. And it
Yes.
happened really quickly, and it happened in a way that she couldn't control because she was at at war. Um, and so she sort of, her relationship with this attention was that she basically she practically rejected it.
Yeah.
She goes home and under an assumed name, and dodges a hero's welcome. She while she does go out in public and meets people, she doesn't attend ceremonies that honor her or anything like this. She's very focused on her work.
Mm.
In her personality and sort of experience and why she's so focused on the work is quite interesting. But she's very focused on the work and sort of what her mission is and what she has to do. And so the first side of what I was describing is that there's this popular sort of image of her as a nurse, which is really
Mm.
what she's doing. It like, did she nurse soldiers? Like, yeah, she did. But really, she's a nursing manager. I mean, she's
Yeah.
managing not one but several sites. She's managing dozens of nursing. She's writing letters constantly, fighting with all kinds of other administrators. And so there's this popular celebrity image of Nightingale, and then everything she does after the war, she's doing it largely behind the scenes. And so
Mm.
there's no associated popular celebrity image of Nightingale, writing letters at 3 a.m. every night, trying to motivate, this prime minister or that MP, or get steal this data set from this officer who she knows has it. Like all of this stuff is being done behind the scenes, and even when a lot of these
Yeah.
publications come out, her name's not actually on it, even though she's the author. She's trying to actually just get the work done, and achieve the things that she wants. And so, there's a whole aspect to Nightingale's story about her womanhood, her role as a particular flavor of feminist, and so that's intersecting with this story as well. And so, if she is a public persona, how much is that helping the campaign? How much is that actually hurting her?
Mm.
And what's actually possible for somebody in her station to actually accomplish? Is she being more effective working behind the scenes, and using soft power instead? And so it's quite a complex story, and because it's complex and because we know there's so many surviving archival resources, this is why people are so attracted to it over and over and over again,
Mm.
because it's so interesting. I mean, people started writing about her, in waves, in 1855, and people haven't stopped since.
Absolutely. And because of the way that, she did handle a celebrity, it's such an interesting kind of comparison to the way that things are handled now when we want to handle social reform. People are using populist platforms and trying to, create this, social energy behind individuals and brand development. But she didn't do any of that. All of that work for her was, trying to minimize that personal individual contribution in order to just get the message across, to be able to get that reform through with the people who would probably not perceive it in as well, it still wasn't perceived in a positive light until quite
Mm.
later. But,
Yeah.
to be able to get that message across without polluting it with her being at the figurehead.
I think she commanded a certain amount of soft power because of her celebrity, meaning
Mm.
you wouldn't want her to actually mobilize that public support that she had.
Yeah.
And I mean, this is a little bit of speculation. This is sort of outside the bounds of my expertise on her, um, but she did, that you go, it's, I forget exactly what the number is, but before the war, there's like 300 little girls named Florence in Britain every year, which is like nothing. And then, years after the war, it's risen to like something like almost 20,000 a year. And it's like,
Wow.
the number 3 or number 4 popular name in Britain. I mean, her popular celebrity, I mean, it's
She was
bigger
a
than
household
Beyonce.
name.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, much larger. And so I think we can intuit that, the celebrity, even though it wasn't maybe enjoyed, was still
Mm.
useful.
Yeah. So would that at that time, I'm not sure if that's within the purview of your research, but would that
Mm.
soft power have had much impact on the work that she was doing, or would it have been more along the lines of the target audience of the Queen, the government, the army? Like, would the people have made the difference?
I I think that the in this sense, her soft power is getting her access to everybody, all
Mm,
the everyone's who's powerful, who she needs. It's also in some sense giving her access to information, um,
mm,
getting her access to data, and then just general kind of information. And in some sense, she is surprised by certain publications that are coming out against her. Um,
mm.
because I mean, she's waging a campaign. I mean, she does have sort of adversaries in this campaign, right?
Yes.
We sort of mentioned them earlier. But there, what's interesting is that her adversaries are also using data visualization
Mm,
in their rhetoric, and their data visualization is actually much closer to what we're familiar with. They're much more sort of standard charts. And what's fantastic is like these aren't the charts that they're not the charts that won. It's her weird charts that actually won the argument. And we don't remember the other charts. We remember her work, and part of that is because of that popular celebrity. But part of that is just because her work was so strong.
absolutely. So, because, aside from, her popular celebrity, what made those diagrams so successful in being able to win that argument for them?
So I think that the diagrams are the most salient part of the diagrams don't stand on their own, and so the diagrams are part of a package, a communications package, and they're always accompanied by a lot of text, by statistical tables. There's a whole um, publicity push where you have everybody, including Charles Dickens, writing in support of their argument and referencing the graphics. And so today, when we see, and this goes back to part of the original inspiration for the book series, is today we'll see one of her diagrams and it will be isolated. It'll be lonely. The diagrams aren't meant to be lonely. They're not meant to be read only a single diagram. You're supposed to see the entire set and read them like a story, from beginning to end. Um, and so, that said, so there's a package of information and a pretty coherent push, what we call, full court press. Um, but beyond that, the graphics themselves are really really interesting. One is that they're very high production value. She's from a wealthy family. She's using her own money, her family's money, to produce these diagrams, so they're colorful, they're big. Um, and then the next thing is that we mentioned that they're kind of weird. They're not like other things. They're not like other diagrams that you've seen. Not too much, at least. And there's a very sort of narrow chain of or short chain of evolution from from a couple circular diagrams that emerged in the late 1820s in France, through her collaborator William Farr, who made some interesting circular diagrams in the very early 1850s, to Nightingale circular diagrams, which come out in the late 1850s. And so there's a direct, like, person to person connection between this very specific circular diagram format that she uses. And what's so fascinating is that there's an evolution even inside her work, because she published the first batch of circular diagrams, and they were criticized because there was a particular mathematical error in how they were constructed, a mathematical error that even pre-existed her work.
mm,
And the second batch corrected this mathematical error. And in correcting this particular mathematical error, the graphic form was greatly strengthened, and also the aesthetic composition of the sheet was also greatly strengthened. And so you can imagine that she sort of had two bites at this particular apple, where she made this first batch in a particular way, but then she got, because they put so much force behind it, she got a lot of feedback. And as I'm a practicing information designer, and feedback is gold. You could be the smartest designer, maybe in any medium, and you can't really make a perfect design. The only way you can make a really really good design is doing the best you can, and then figuring out ways to get feedback on it. Whether it's the public or some other. and then you learn actually how people actually interact with it. Is it how you intended, or is it not? And so Nightingale had that feedback loop, and got that opportunity the second bite of the apple. And that second bite is it produced a 3 diagram story. The middle diagram is the one that is most reproduced of all of her contributions.
Yes. And yeah, I saw that there were some, comments being made that, the kind of work that she did could easily have been represented in a standard bar chart.
Mm,
And, that's true. But the thing that I thought was most interesting about her diagrams was that because it was a time series, having it in that circular format allowed you to
mm.
more easily convey that passage of time and connect that to the change of events that occurred as a result of the reform. But, at what point do we go from, it conveys that information perfectly as a bar chart
Mm.
to being able to present it in a novel way that doesn't distract from the content itself?
Yes. So yeah, I mean, bar charts are safe. They're familiar. That's sort of one of the things we started with.
Mm,
Um, but the problem is that they're common, and so you might make a standard bar chart, and it's not going to attract any attention. And and so you might do something more daring and more original. And the trade-off is that you might attract attention with it, but you might also introduce a barrier to access. That it's going
mm,
to take longer for people to understand what the heck is going on here. And one of the problems that we suffer with in our modern information ecosystem is that people don't read books anymore. People don't spend a lot of time with content. People are consuming most information on screens that are smaller than a piece of toast. And so if you want to convey something that you might have to be very expeditious with it and use that bar chart. Nightingale's information ecosystem, people are reading a lot more that I think than people read today. They're reading maybe not a lot more, but they're reading more long form content, I think, than we do today.
mm,
And so there's a certain patience. And remember also, because this is over 150 years ago, that the information design norms that we're familiar with today are not as well established then. And so there is probably an opportunity also to be a little bit more wacky with your
mm.
work, because really, what is familiar? Certainly things are not as familiar as they are today.
Absolutely. And that is an interesting kind of thing to consider because at that time they did have that burst of access to information, especially with the steam printing press with the rollers. A lot more people were able to access
Yeah.
information more quickly, more timely. The information was, people were able to
Mhm.
get news that was new a lot sooner than before.
Yes.
So, yeah, it was a very interesting time to be able to present all of her content, all of her information, and make it in such an accessible format for the population.
Yeah.
So, what impact did Florence Nightingale's work have on data visualization as we know it today?
Hmm. That's a good question. So I think that it's been her impact on the craft of data visualization is really interesting, because her diagram is sometimes imitated, but usually not successfully. Um, Meaning that it's really hard to pull off what she pulled off.
Mm,
And it might be because the particular format she used was perfectly tuned to the data story she wanted to tell.
yeah.
And if you just lift that same form to different content, it just doesn't work as well. Um,
Mm,
Early on, she's one of the few woman, data visualization practitioners. And so she's sort of been tokenized as kind of, people point to her as like, here's the one lady who did it. It turns out there's actually several ladies who did it, and even before her, and certainly a little bit after her. And so, but yet she's still elevated as kind of like the token data visualization gal, if that
mm,
makes sense. Which
yeah.
I think for a long time was really nice, but I think that she was sort of um, famous for in the same way that she was a celebrity, generally, maybe she was celebrated, for reasons that, weren't properly understood. And that was part of the thing that drew me into this book, is trying to really understand, well, you know, what did she do? Like, what did she do and why did she do this? And try to understand, like, is there a story here or not? And, it turns out it's quite an incredible story behind it.
It is an incredible story. But so, what surprised you? What did you find most interesting in the course of researching and writing this book or this essay?
Oh my goodness. So I mean, writing is a very strange pursuit. And this is the first history that I've written, book length history that I've written, and so I think that reconstructing reconstructing her world in my own mind and trying to fill in, as many pieces as I could, that was a joy, that there was so much content and pieces out there, and that I was able to find them and, sort of, reassemble. I don't, if it's 1,000 piece jigsaw puzzle, finding enough pieces to the puzzle and putting them back together so that you can get, a sense of, of this story, right? And so that whole process, again, this is maybe a little bit of a meta comment, but that whole process was incredibly satisfying. I remember at one point, turning to my partner while I was writing this, and, because I wrote it during the pandemic, is like, I had a better sense of the month to month of Nightingale's world than I did of my own, because during the pandemic and lockdown, everything, especially living here in
Blurred.
California, yeah, everything was blurry. Everything kind of seemed the same. So I did, there's no sense of what month it was. Whereas, I could tell you what was happening in every week of 1857. um, and so that again, this is maybe a personal reflection, but going on that
Yeah.
process was really satisfying. And then everything that I mean, look, there's so many, like, little nuggets that are
Yes.
mostly all made the cut, but things like that. While Nightingale was doing this, Farr was working with the first machine information technology, the first
Mm.
machine computer. Um, Things like, Charles Dickens is helping their cause, which we mentioned earlier. Things
Yeah.
like, I read an old catalog of everything the British Library holds on, in their Nightingale collection, and I read a description of a hand drawn draft diagram, um, and I was like, wait, what? And it turns out, and nobody's ever, these have never been published or anything, but there's a whole set of early drafts with Nightingale pencil edits, explaining, use this line weight and this line, this color, and, all of these details. I mean, the fact that this exists is absolutely spectacular. And
Yes.
so, how rich the story is, how interconnected the story is to, and you sort of picked up on this earlier, how
Mm.
interconnected the story is to kind of everything else that's exciting that's going on at this time, whether it's technology or the ravages of colonialism, um, everything happening in medicine, everything happening in social science and urban design, the role of women in society. Like, there's just all of these things flying around.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's again, there's a reason why people have been attracted to her and to
Mm.
her story for 150 years.
Yeah. And just as I was reading through, I just kept making notes for myself going, yes, Jon Snow and cholera and figuring out,
Mm,
his little mud map of, disease spread. And then, you know, in France, they were doing the crime statistics, that new idea of social physics and social
yes.
statistics.
Yeah.
And, that was, going to be just before the, Jack the Ripper murders. And,
Mm.
everything there was just so interconnected. And you forget how much actually did happen in that period that advanced so many things.
Yeah, the Jon Snow story, which is sort of a margin note in the book.
Yeah.
I mean, that's a good example of how interconnected things were, because the Broad Street cholera outbreak, for, any listeners who's not familiar, Jon Snow is sort of the other top epidemiological talent in England at the time. He and William Farr, And unfortunately, Jon Snow, ended up dying very young at the age of like 47 or something. And so Farr kind of goes on and carries the torch. Um, but so it's September. There's a polluted water source. Jon Snow has, maybe for a decade, has this theory about cholera being in bad water, and so maybe 800 people died, and it's a couple days into the epidemic, and Jon Snow works with the authorities to remove the pump handle. Months later, he makes a map, and so this is again, this is not a tool of analysis. It's,
Mm,
sort of foreshadows Nightingale. It's not a tool of analysis, but Jon Snow makes a map, and similar to Nightingale, there's actually several maps. And so the
mm,
first map is done by an engineer, the second by Snow, and then Jon Snow gets a second bite of the apple, and he makes even a third map. But this map is iconic in terms of epidemiology and persuasive cartography. But it basically shows like, hey, here's all the deaths, and they're all centered on this particular polluted water pump. So where's the intersection? Well, it turns out that Nightingale was working in a hospital taking care of patients from this epidemic, and
mm,
this outbreak of cholera. And she's taking care of actually, I think mostly prostitutes at a hospital that was just off the map. So just like on the northern, like 2 blocks north of the boundary of Jon Snow's, this famous persuasive cartography. So
yeah,
Nightingale almost made the map, or at least the building she was in almost made the map. But it shows how exciting this is, and it's also maybe a function of we have all this early technology, exciting modern technology, whether it's steam driven processes or otherwise, the telegraph, and so these are helping really really concentrate power.
mm,
In a similar way that we have power highly concentrated in our society today through digital technology, they were concentrating power. And so I think one of the reasons that it is so exciting is that there are these characters. And these characters just keep popping up, and they all seem to know each other, and
yeah,
they all seem to go on these adventures with one another. And so I think that's an aspect of the environment as well.
absolutely. It's very fascinating to read, and I remember stopping halfway and just not being able to contain myself from just messaging a friend going, "You have to read this book. There's just so much going on. You don't understand.
Mm.
It's just everyone's connected." And yeah, it's an excellent read. I highly recommend anyone to get their hands on it. So, just wonderful conversation about this. I could totally keep talking about the history of the 1800s with you at this point. Um, we should probably start wrapping up. So, what I do normally at the end of my conversations is I ask three soft questions. A lot of people dispute the fact that they're soft, and it's just
Mm.
unrelated to the work, but just a little adds a little bit of interest. And given the breadth of your work, I think that it'll be interesting to see what comes out of this. But first
Mm.
off, what hobby or interest do you have that is most unrelated to your field of work?
Um, so I mean, one of the nice things about being a data storyteller is, you can make a data story about nearly anything, but the thing that's really saved my mental health throughout this pandemic is paddling. So
Oh,
I'm very lucky to live in San Francisco, and even more lucky that the San Francisco Bay is 2 blocks that way.
oh,
And so
nice.
I drag my kayak out of the garage several times a week, and we have a beach, and I'm able to go right into the water. And several times a week, I go out, I see all the seabirds. We have sea lions. I go say hello to the sea lions.
Oh,
Sometimes we see
wonderful.
a harbor seal. Rarely you see porpoise, but sometimes you see porpoise. I'm fairly deep into the bay, so they don't usually come this deep, but that's a really lovely activity to sort of clear the mind, get off the screens, deal with the waves, and check the tides, and get a little exercise. And so again, that's saved my mental health for the last couple of years.
Can imagine it very meditative to be able to just get out there in your own, just in the quiet and just relax and take in nature for a change.
Exactly. Yes.
Yeah. Okay. And which childhood book holds the strongest memories for you?
So I was gonna respond and ask you like, well, what kind of book do you mean? But since we're talking about data storytelling, I actually have two of my childhood books here with me, and my that I really loved growing up. And so one is from a little bit earlier than the other. So this one I wrote about this in my first book, loving this book. But this is actually a magazine series, and so this is called Zoo Books,
Oh, cool.
and so this is a copy of sort of a National Geographic light for kids type of publication, but this spread in particular always stuck with me. And I don't know if you can see this, but it's a pictorial representation of all the food an elephant has to eat in a year.
Oh,
And it's
wow.
and to describe it to anybody just listening, you have a single Indian elephant and a zookeeper sort of scratching their head, and you have giant enormous mounds of hay and alfalfa and potatoes and bread, and then you have water trucks just stretching to the horizon. And so, content like this, illustrated diagrams, always, since I was really little, really, sort of captured my attention. And so I think I mean, that's not a book, it's a magazine, but
Yeah.
that sort of evolved to like pieces like this, like a book about cross sectioning. This one
Yes.
is cross sections man of war. And so the type of thing where you can look at a diagram. Again, this isn't statistical data, but you can
No,
you
but
can
it's
look at this
still
book.
storytelling. Yeah.
It's storytelling, and it's full of detail, and it's doing the same thing that statistical data visualization, statistical abstract charts are doing. Is like it's giving you a view of reality that's not possible in any other way. And
Absolutely.
that's and that I just love this kind of stuff, whether it's a cutaway
Yes.
diagram or some sort of explanation. This is some of the early content that I was I was growing up with, that really that I can look back to and see the breadcrumbs.
Yes, absolutely. And it's all that sort of information because as a child, the idea of scale and scope really is difficult to kind of convey sometimes. And
Mm,
so images like that, it's like, yes, that's an elephant, it's huge, it eats a lot. But how much is a lot? That much is a lot. And
mhm.
it's such an easy way to convey that kind of information to a child in when they're forming all these ideas about how the world works. And yeah,
Yes,
definitely I have some of those cross-section books as well, and it's just wonderful even as an adult to have a look and just see how these things work and how these things look in that kind of shape. It's great.
absolutely.
Yeah. And lastly, what advice would you give someone who'd like to get into data visualization and data storytelling, and what advice should they ignore?
So I think that the best advice is, there's a lot of theory that's very attractive, and there's a lot of kind of books. I even wrote one about how to do it, but like the most important thing to do is to do the work. Figure out a way to make lots of charts, figure out a way to make lots of data stories, and do the work. And you'll spend, I don't know, at least 5 years maybe, doing the work and figuring out how to do it in ways the ways that work for you, the ways that inspire you, the ways that hopefully create something interesting and valuable to somebody else, so you can keep doing it. And so learning through practice is important in any craft, but I think in particular this one.
Absolutely. All right. So thank you so much, RJ, for speaking with me today. It has been so wonderful speaking with you about your book, about your journey, and yeah, just sharing in your passion for Nightingale's story and all the work that she did, and how everything kind of pulled together with the data, the people, and just getting this insight into that period in time where there was so much change and reform and flux in the way that we did so many different things.
Absolutely.
Yeah,
Thank you, Michelle. My pleasure.
thank you. So, if people would like to know more about your work, where can they go?
So Twitter, info we trust at info we trust, and the book is going to go on pre-sale soon at visionarypress.com.
Excellent, brilliant. Those will definitely be put in the show notes. All right, so thank you again, RJ. It's been really wonderful speaking with you, and I hope you have an amazing rest of your evening.
Okay, good night.
Good night. Florence Nightingale's story and her commitment to sanitary reform is absolutely inspiring, and RJ has beautifully conveyed her passion and her brilliance in his book Florence Nightingale and her mortality and health diagrams. To learn more about Florence Nightingale, RJ's work, or to connect with us, please visit the Steampowered website at steampoweredshow.com. You can also find out more about RJ's work on Twitter at InfoWeTrust, and the Information Graphic Visionaries book series will be available at visionarypress.com, the links for which will be in the show notes. If you enjoyed this conversation, please let me know. Subscribe to the show, leave a comment, and share this with your geeky or geek-curious friends. You can also support Steam Powered on Patreon and Ko-fi under Steam Powered Show, the links for which will also be in the show notes. Thanks for tuning in, and we'll see you next time.